Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained YouTube video, I'm going to have a look at everything you need to know about debates about globalisation in Edexcel A Level Politics. I'm going to start by having a look at the parts of specification this video covers, before having a look at some potential essay questions you could get asked on this topic in the exam, both 12 markers and 30 markers. I'm then going to have a look at the different perspectives on globalisation. So there are three key perspectives on globalisation that you're going to want to bring in to your 30-mark essays in particular, before looking at how liberals and realists fit into these perspectives. We're then going to have a look at the impact of globalisation on state sovereignty, which is one of the key debates about globalisation in this part of the specification, looking at arguments that globalisation has undermined state sovereignty and arguments that it hasn't, as well as a really important A-star level perspective you could think about bringing to the evaluation in your essays. And then finally, we're going to have a look at the advantages and disadvantages of globalisation, breaking it down into economic globalisation, political globalisation, and cultural globalisation. The notes you can see on your screen are part of an updating textbook on the global politics section of the Edexcel A Level Politics specification that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in your politics A level, including global politics essay plans and 12 marker plans. Essay plans and 12 marker plans covering all other parts of the A Level Politics specification, as well as updating textbooks that I update regularly so you're always up to date, that cover the whole of the A Level Politics specification. If you're also interested, there's a place to sign up for tutoring if you're interested, and live written webinars that we're running this year before the A Level Politics exams. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So in terms of the parts of specification these notes cover, so the first video we had a look at was looking at the nation state and national sovereignty and globalisation, really giving you an introduction to what globalisation is in terms of economic globalisation, cultural globalisation, and political globalisation. As well as by looking at national sovereignty and the nation state, we really had a look at the state system and the impact of globalisation on the state system. What we're going to have a look at now is the key debates in relation to globalisation. It's going to be really useful because there's a lot of arguments in here that you can use in specific essays that are going to come up in A Level Politics. So looking at those different perspectives on globalisation that you can bring in, as well as the overall kind of real advantages of and disadvantages of globalisation and its implications for the nation state and national sovereignty in a bit more detail. These essay questions here are really useful ones that you can use to practice the state and globalisation topic, so they cover the whole of the state and globalisation topic. All of the ones in bold are covered on the Politics Explained website. You can find detailed essay plans or 12 marker plans for all of the questions in bold, and they're the real ones I've selected, the best ones that if you really practice, know those well and revise them well, you should be able to kind of adapt them to different questions and be able to answer most questions in politics because of the content that's within them. So yeah, in terms of this video, it's going to be really useful for a lot of these 30 markers, such as evaluate the view that globalisation has more advantages and disadvantages. We're going to look at really specific arguments on either side for that. The impact of it on national sovereignty, as well as kind of the view that globalisation is under threat, and particularly the perspectives you can bring in to a lot of these essays. And it is also going to be useful for these 12 markers as well. So yeah, let's start off by having a look at the different perspectives on globalisation. So globalisation has sparked a lot of debate among scholars, policymakers, politicians, thinkers. And there's a lot of disagreement about the extent to which globalisation is new and the extent to which it influences economies, politics, and the nation state. And there are three key perspectives: hyperglobalisers, transformationalists, and globalisation skeptics. So the first one we're going to have a look at is hyperglobalisers. So they argue that globalisation is a really transformative force reshaping the world into a highly interconnected global system, where nation states are less relevant and global cooperation is central to tackling kind of global and global economic and political challenges. So they really see globalisation as really transformative and significant. So they see technological advancements, the expansion of global markets and the growing influence of multinational corporations as really leading to the declining importance of the nation state. So globalisation is so important, so transformative that the nation state has really declined in its importance and its power. It's really globalisation has eroded traditional borders and created a global marketplace. So as nation states have declined in power, hyperglobalisers believe that global institutions, so international organisations in particular, are increasingly important international actors as well, such as multinational corporations. And these kind of international bodies and organizations have taken power away, economic and political power away from the nation state. And many hyper-globalizers actually believe in the benefits of this change. They argue that globalization can lift millions out of poverty, spread democracy, and facilitate the exchange of knowledge and technology, leading to overall progress across the world. The European Union is often cited as a case study by hyperglobalizers as how globalization can really transform economies and politics. So through the real integration and cooperation of markets, free movement of goods, capital and people across the European Union, it's reduced the relevance of individual nation states in many areas, particularly economically and in terms of trade, while supranational institutions like the European Central Bank and the European Commission kind of really managed economic and political processes and have a lot more power. Again, we'll look at that in way more detail in the video on the European Union, so you'll be able to use that even better as a case study later on. Globalization skeptics are on the complete other side. So they argue that globalization has exacerbated divisions between countries and failed to create a more cooperative, interconnected world. So they believe that globalization has been positive, but crucially, they also believe that actually its significance has been overstated. So they believe the decline of the nation state is greatly overstated, and that nation states continue to have significant power, be the most important actor on the global stage, and continue to prioritize their own sovereignty and national interests. So they argue that actually globalization isn't even new or transformative. It's a continuation of long-standing patterns of international trade and interaction between countries that has happened for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they really push back against hyperglobalizers' beliefs that globalization has fundamentally changed the nature of global politics. There's always been interaction between countries in their view. Politics is influenced by other countries, but what happens within countries continues to be the most important and dominate, and that's when nation states continue to have major power. So crucially, as I said, they believe that the nation state remains the key actor in global politics, with international institutions like the UN and World Trade Organization actually having little power and simply being used by powerful states as tools to advance their own interests, rather than there being true global cooperation or these institutions having real power. A case study to kind of illustrate this and support this is the US-China trade war, which kind of really started under Trump's first presidency. It supports the argument that nation states remain the key actor in global politics, and that international institutions have little power to control them. So despite decades of economic integration under globalization, China and the US engaged in a trade conflict that resulted in tariffs and restrictions, as they both prioritize their own economic interests, and really undermining this idea that globalization leads to harmony and countries working together, and that international institutions are more important than nation states, because ultimately the World Trade Organization was sidelined and international organizations had little power to really do anything to stop the United States and China engaging in this trade war. So it suggests that nation states still remain really dominant. The final perspective then is somewhere in the middle. It's a middle ground perspective, and this is transformationalists. And I think if you're really struggling with the global politics part of the specification, it's a really difficult part of the A Level Politics specification. I'll maybe kind of shift away from this one, just focus on those first two. But for those of you who are really looking to kind of push up and who think you can kind of take this on board and understand it and use it, so you can use this one as well. And they take a middle ground perspective. So they view globalization as a powerful force that is reshaping societies and economies. So they agree with hyperglobalizers that is important, it is transformative. But they don't believe it's making the nation state irrelevant. So rather than kind of eroding the power of the nation state and making sure it has little power and making it irrelevant, they argue that globalization is transforming global politics and economy. So it's making it different, but that states can adapt to it and maintain their sovereignty. So they view globalization as kind of really complex and an uneven process that influences different countries differently in different sectors of economies differently as well. And it doesn't simply kind of naturally, as hyperglobalizers quite simply argue, lead to nation states losing power. Instead, it influences different states unevenly. So while some states may see their sovereignty reduced, others can actually use it to adapt and thrive in this more interconnected world and really maximize their power, particularly strong states like the US and China. So they ultimately argue that globalization is transforming the role of nation states rather than simply eroding state power, and it's not really as simple as that. But they do argue that globalization is an important transformative force, so they're not like globalization skeptics. So states really have to adapt to the new reality of globalization by interacting with and through international governmental organizations, multinational corporations, and non-governmental organizations too. A case study we can use for that is China and globalization. So China's really transformed as an economy under globalization, but so it's really become interconnected. The world's manufacturing hub is really interconnected with other countries, but there's still strong state control. There hasn't been a decline in state power. Instead, China's been able, and the state has been able to use globalization to its advantage by strategically collaborating with other countries, multinational corporations, and global institutions, whilst really asserting its own sovereignty and its own interests. So, where do liberals and realists fit into these perspectives? So liberals, we can kind of suggest, would largely align with hyperglobalisers, seeing globalisation as a positive force that fosters greater interconnectedness, cooperation, and mutual prosperity. They argued that economic independence reduces the likelihood of conflict, and countries benefit from more trading cooperation than from competition and war, and therefore are much less likely to go to war. They also view international institutions and corporations as central to managing global challenges, and see international institutions having significant power and decreasing the power of nation states somewhat. This being said, some liberals probably wouldn't go as far as agreeing that globalization makes the nation state irrelevant and they will be replaced by a world government, though. And therefore, they kind of maybe find themselves between the perspectives of hyperglobalizers and transformationalists. Realists, on the other hand, more closely align with globalization skeptics. They argue that despite kind of economic interconnectedness, that the nation state ultimately remains sovereign and remains the most important actor in global politics, with globalization or international institutions doing little to alter this reality. They argue that states often use international governmental institutions as tools to pursue their own goals and influence other states, therefore also showing some alignment with the perspective of transformationists and how nation states have adapted to globalization and used it to pursue their own sovereign interests. So, next thing we're going to say, we're kind of the three perspectives on globalization. The next thing we're going to have a look at is the impact of globalization on state sovereignty. Firstly, looking at arguments that globalization has undermined state sovereignty. And this could be a key question you could get just in the exam. Evaluate the view that globalization has undermined state sovereignty, for example, or something similar. First key argument that globalization has undermined state sovereignty is that economic globalization has removed state control over national economies. So before globalization, when states had much less interaction with each other, economies were largely national. Most things that were consumed within the country were produced within the country, and there was not as much interaction with other countries, and therefore state governments had a lot of control over their own economies. The argument is that economic globalization has removed a lot of this control, because there's so much more interaction with other countries, that what happens in another country can really influence the economy of a state, and a national government ultimately can't control what happens in that other country, or they can't control what happens in the boardroom of a multinational corporation, because they have a lot of power, often within a lot of states. They're the vehicle for a lot of global trade, and if a government can't control the decisions that are made, they've lost ultimately sovereignty over their economy and the ability to control it. So yeah, private entities such as Apple and Amazon hold substantial economic power, often exceeding that of states, and as they provide significant jobs and taxes to countries, but they can threaten to move production elsewhere. They can really influence domestic policy in their interest, because countries don't want to lose these multinational corporations. An example of this is Ireland's relationship with Apple, where the company set up its European headquarters in exchange for favourable tax arrangements. Apple benefited from a really, really low corporate tax rate, and really influence Ireland's economy and Ireland's decision making, because it recognised that by lowering its corporation tax rate, it was able to attract these jobs. So that gave Apple significant power, because within the country, to kind of maintain this low corporation tax rate, even if there was pressure from the European Commission and the European Union to not do so. As I said, a state's economic performance is now also very dependent on global markets outside of their control. So a crisis in the housing market in the United States can influence the world and cause recession across the world, as happened in the 2008 financial crisis. And that means national governments have very little control, and nation states have less control over their economies, as they're so interconnected, and decisions in one part of the world they have no control over, or very, very little control over, can fundamentally shape their nation's economy. And cultural and political globalization arguably amplify these challenges. by spreading consumerism and free market capitalism, which further erode traditional economic structures and undermine national control over economies. Second argument, then, that globalisation has undermined national sovereignty is that global issues force cooperation and undermine states' ability to act unilaterally. So, as globalisation has made states a lot more connected and interlinked, a large amount of the challenges that face states today transcend national borders, such as, for example, climate change, which requires states to work together and cooperate through political globalisation, rather than just being able to make decisions on their own. And they need to come together to tackle it. And that shows the importance of political globalisation in international governmental institutions. Similarly, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the need for global collaboration in vaccine distribution, travel restrictions, and economic recovery plans. And due to the global travel and the interconnected nature of economies, countries couldn't just tackle COVID individually. They had to cooperate. Because whatever they did individually, that was going to be influenced by other countries' decisions as well. So to really try and bring down the number of deaths in the pandemic and really tackle the pandemic, they needed to cooperate. And that kind of requirement for states to work together to tackle challenges suggests that nation states no longer have as much control over the key challenges that face them as they used to do. And economic globalisation intensifies this need for political cooperation as interconnected economies rely on shared financial regulations and really shared economies to prevent and respond to crises like the 2008 financial crisis. And this pressures states to surrender aspects of their sovereignty, shifting decision-making power to international bodies that can make decisions internationally, such as the World Health Organization, the European Union, the United Nations, for example. The final argument then that globalisation has undermined state sovereignty is that political globalisation constrains how states can act. So political globalisation has created international frameworks and global governance frameworks that limit state autonomy, as IGOs like the UN, International Criminal Court, and the EU set binding rules on issues such as trade, human rights, and conflict resolution. And if states break these rules, their sovereignty can be justifiably infringed upon in the name of upholding the rules. And that really is a clear example where national sovereignty is decreased. So, for example, within the European Union, there are a set of laws that nation states have to sign up to. And if they breach the laws, they can be fined or they can be forced to reverse their decisions, which shows a real limit in nation states' power. So, for example, in 2015, Greece was sanctioned by the EU for breaching the common agricultural policy of the EU that it had signed up to by providing unlawful subsidies to its farmers. And that the EU was then required Greece to repay over 400 million euros in misused funds, demonstrating how the kind of international institutions of globalisation can infringe upon a state's internal sovereignty and limit their ability to make their own decisions. Exactly the same can be seen in terms of humanitarian interventions. If a state often doesn't uphold human rights norms, less so now, but we'll have a look at that in future videos, but especially in the early 2000s, especially in the late 1990s, the international community, sanctioned by the UN Security Council often, would then go and intervene militarily to get rid of that government or stop those human rights abuses happening. For example, in 2011, with the removal of the Gaddafi regime and the intervention by NATO forces in particular in Libya, and that shows a nation state has really lost control over completely controlling everything within its borders, because if it doesn't uphold human rights norms, other states are going to come in unauthorized by international organizations and tell them what to do. So it really shows how political globalization, these international organizations, international law, international norms of political globalization has really constrained how states can act. So therefore, international law challenges state sovereignty by requiring compliance with global norms, limiting the freedom of states to act independently in pursuit of their national interests. On the other hand, there are a number of arguments that globalization actually hasn't undermined state sovereignty. The first key one being that while economic globalization has increased economic interdependence, states still retain significant control over their national economies. So it's a real counterpoint to that first argument we looked at on the other side of the debate. So they can use tools like tariffs, regulations as subsidies to really promote the national interest and really exert significant control over their economy still. So China does participate in global markets and its economy is influenced by other countries, and there is clear kind of interconnectedness It maintains firm control over key economic sectors, such as technology and state-owned enterprises. This allows it to reshape its own economic development. The United States has also demonstrated that it will impose tariffs and protectionist measures under both the Republicans under Trump and under the Democrats. So it can really shows that these tariffs are tools that nation states, can use to continue to exert control over their national economies. And subsidies, they can subsidize sectors as well. This shows that while states engage in globalization and economic globalization and global trade, they do retain power to regulate and protect their own economies. A second key argument is that states still have internal sovereignty. So when we looked at in the first video, go back and have a look at it, the difference between internal and external sovereignty. So the argument is that actually, despite globalization, states still maintain largely internal sovereignty, the ability to control their borders, regulate immigration, and protect national interests in global negotiations. So the rise of populism across the world has led many states to reassert this national sovereignty. And Australia is a really good example of this. It kind of has really maintained sovereignty through strict border and immigration policies that it's decided to do. It really has strongly tried to prevent unauthorized illegal immigration, and border protection agencies intercept boats carrying asylum seekers and process asylum claims in offshore facilities. This demonstrates that globalization has not eroded a state's capacity to regulate migration and protect its borders and territorial integrity. Additionally, in international negotiations, states can assert their national interests and achieve favourable terms. So they can really kind of push within globalization frameworks for their national interests. So, for example, during the renegotiation of NAFTA, Canada successfully protected its dairy industry by negotiating limits on US dairy imports, really asserting its national economic interests in preserving domestic markets for its dairy farmers. That showed national governments, nation states still have significant internal sovereignty and the ability to control things within their borders and make decisions. And finally, the kind of final key argument is that states ultimately choose to participate in political globalization in international governmental organizations, and they can ultimately leave them. So states voluntarily participate in political globalization, so they voluntarily join the United Nations, or join the World Trade Organization, or join the European Union, and can retain the ability to leave or not join in the first place. And if they leave, they can regain all of that sovereignty that had been ceded to international organizations. And a key example of that is the United Kingdom leaving the European Union in Brexit and regaining a lot of that sovereignty they had ceded to the European Union. Similarly, not all states have ratified the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and decided not to join, reflecting the fact that they're unwilling to seek that sovereignty in matters of international justice and can protect their own sovereignty. Additionally, powerful states in particular have the power to ignore rulings or recommendations from international bodies. There isn't a global police force that can force them to do something. For example, in 2016, in relation to the South China Sea, China rejected a ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration that invalidates its territorial claims. It just said, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to assert these claims anyway and just completely reject the recommendation. That shows, this kind of reflects often a realist perspective that would argue that these international organizations, particularly international judicial organizations, have little real power. So they're the key arguments on either side that you could use. Of course, there are other arguments you can bring in, but there are kind of three key ones on either side that you can bring in about whether globalization has or hasn't undermined national sovereignty. A final kind of little thing we're going to have a look at is an A-star level perspective that you don't have to use, of course, but it's that globalization has undermined the sovereignty of some states more than others. So it can be argued that wealthier and more powerful states retain significant sovereignty and influence within global politics, whilst in comparison poorer and less powerful states have less power under globalization to project their interests and are more constrained therefore by economic and political globalization. So powerful states can really use their economic power to shape global rules and bend political globalization in particular to their advantage, therefore maintain control over their domestic policy. For example, within the WTO, the US has kind of really pushed policies that really protect its own economic interests. For example, pushing for strong intellectual property protections that benefit American pharmaceutical and technology companies. And powerful states, as we just mentioned, can also decide to ignore international law and rulings when it's convenient. For example, the US invaded Iraq in 2003 to pursue its own interests, despite it not being authorized by the United Nations and being illegal under international law. On the other hand, weaker states' sovereignty is more compromised due to their dependence on foreign aid and global institutions. So Greece during the Eurozone crisis had to accept things that weren't in its interests, or a large share of its population didn't want. So these are harsh austerity measures and structural reforms mandated by these international governmental organisations, including the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund, um, kind of limiting its ability to enact independent economic policies. And because it was poorer and it was weaker, it has less power to kind of say no to international organisations. It's forced to kind of accept them as they really required the economic assistance because of their poor economic situation. Similarly, many African and Latin American nations have been really reliant on loans from the World Bank or foreign investment, and therefore been pressured by international organisations, such as the IMF and World Bank, to implement free market reforms that they may not support and may not be in their economic interests. We'll look at that in a lot more detail when we look at the IMF and World Bank in terms of these structural adjustment programs. Further, weaker states can't ignore international law and rulings in the same way that powerful states can. And they're subject to the majority of international rulings because there'll be pressure on them to implement them from more powerful states, and they just simply often don't have the clout and the power to say no. For example, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, disproportionately focus on Africa, with the vast majority of cases being from African nations, despite human rights violations occurring globally. Okay, so in the final part of this video, we're going to have a look at the advantages and disadvantages of globalization, broken down into economic globalization, political globalization, and cultural globalization. So for both economic globalization and political globalization, there's going to be even more detail on these arguments in the next video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel, which is on globalization and contemporary issues. So it's going to be more of a summary of the arguments here, but more detail on the kind of case studies to support it and detail on the arguments in there. So make sure to have a look at that video too, but we will kind of summarize the arguments here. So in terms of the advantages of economic globalization, it can be argued that economic globalization has a profoundly positive impact on global economies by promoting economic growth, reducing poverty as a result, and fostering innovation. So one of the key benefits has been the expansion of international trade, which has allowed countries to kind of export into larger markets and thus increase economic output and job creation. You've seen the global economy triple in size as a result. And this has really benefited particularly a lot of emerging economies like China, which has experienced rapid industrialization and saw over 800 million people lifted out of poverty as a result of economic globalization. It's also led to foreign direct investment in countries, bringing much needed capital and investment, particularly for developing countries. Then we'll look at the drawbacks of that in a minute. And it's also led to it's also led to kind of the free flow of technology and knowledge has also helped developing nations access advanced technologies, enabling them to kind of leapfrog traditional stages of industrialization. That's particularly, for example, through the internet. And another example of that is renewable energy, which have kind of spread rapidly across borders, helping countries reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. And of course, beyond economic growth and those benefits in terms of reducing poverty, globalization has increased consumer access to a wider range of goods and services, driving down prices and improving living standards worldwide. On the other hand, it can actually be argued that globalization has had more disadvantages than advantages. It hasn't had uniformly positive impacts for all countries, especially for developing nations and vulnerable populations. So a key criticism is that it's deepened global economic inequality, with wealthier nations and multinational corporations benefiting disproportionately from globalization, whilst poorer countries remain reliant on exporting raw materials and low-wage labour. So the rise of global supply chains has led to a race to the bottom, where countries compete by offering cheap labour, leading to poor working conditions and limited worker protections, particularly in industries like textiles and electronics. We'll give some more examples, we'll look at more detail in the next video, as I said. And international governmental organisations, as we'll look at in more detail in the IMF and World Bank video, have often made financial assistance to developing countries that really need these loans depend on implementing free market reforms, and this has often had really negative impacts on their countries, giving wealthier countries more continued access to raw materials, but deepened poverty within particularly a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, and in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean as well. Further economic globalization has left many countries vulnerable to global market fluctuations. So, 2008 financial crisis, for example, started in America, but led to recessions in loads and loads of other countries. And it's enabled the dominance of multinational corporations as well, which often exploit weaker states by pressuring governments to enact regulations that favour them and their corporations, by threatening otherwise to leave the country and therefore move jobs away. And of course, we'll look at this in way more detail in the next video, but the rapid industrialization and expansion of global trade has had a hugely detrimental impact on the planet and on climate change as well. In terms of political globalization, again, a lot more, a lot of this is covered in a lot more detail in future videos, particularly when we look at global governance, political global governance, but we'll summarize some of the arguments here. So the advantages is that actually the establishment of the UN, WHO, WTO, all of these international organizations has facilitated cooperation on conflict resolution, climate change, public health, and other international issues that require a global response, and countries to work together to tackle and respond to them. And therefore, it's been really beneficial. Similarly, it's helped in the promotion of human rights through the UN and International Criminal Court in particular, holding individuals account for crimes against humanity. Again, future is going to look at all of these in way more detail. And it could also be argued that the growing interconnectedness among nations through political globalization has contributed to a more stable and cooperative global system. As there's more frameworks for how they can kind of tackle, resolve disputes rather than resorting to conflict. On the other hand, political globalization can be argued to actually have more disadvantages. So IGOs like the UN and IMF have been accused of implementing policies that primarily benefit more powerful nations, especially because these more powerful nations have more power within these international organizations. Additionally, international organizations have been criticized for eroding state sovereignty, particularly the European Union. And finally, Rees would argue that actually political globalization hasn't had much impact, and that international governmental organizations, in fact, have little power to influence states and uphold peace or human rights globally, as shown in Israel's war in Gaza and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both of which have violated international law, and international governmental organizations have been able to do very little to stop. The final thing to have a look at then is the advantages and disadvantages of cultural globalization, which we're going to look at in a bit more detail because it's not covered in another video. So, one key advantage of cultural globalization is the promotion of cultural diversity across the world, where different cuisines, fashion, art, and music have spread globally, which has allowed people across the world to experience and appreciate cultures beyond their own, really breaking down cultural barriers. Furthermore, social media and the internet have accelerated the spread of social and political movements, including those which advocate for social justice, environmental awareness, and really challenge really powerful actors, so politicians globally and corporations globally. For example, Fridays for Future is a really good example of that, which started by Greta Thunberg in Sweden, united young people across the world to kind of pressure their politicians and companies to tackle climate change, and had some really transformative impacts as well. Similarly, the Me Too movement gained traction internationally and sparked conversations about gender equality and sexual harassment across cultures. It can also be argued the spread of English as a global language has improved global communication and collaboration across nations, aiding education and business. And it can also be argued that it's linked to political globalization, but cultural globalization, particularly through social media and the interlinking of different cultures and communication networks, has allowed for values like democracy, human rights, and environmental sustainability to spread quite quickly, and that's influenced politics as well. On the other hand, cultural globalization can be argued to actually have far more disadvantages than advantages, as it's been criticised for promoting homogenization and eroding local cultures, leading to what some refer to as a global monoculture, where there's very little diversity. So as multinational corporations and media conglomerates such as Disney, such as Netflix, dominate global markets, it can be argued that actually they've undermined and overshadowed local traditions and languages. So the spread of fast food chains like McDonald's and Hollywood films has led to a dilution of traditional culinary practices and local entertainment industries. Further, as these kind of media conglomerates have gained influence, local artists and cultural creators have arguably lost some control over how their culture is represented. And the kind of cultural narratives and traditions are increasingly shaped by global media corporations in terms of how they're presented and understood across the world rather than the local communities themselves. And that's really resulting in misrepresentation. For example, African cultural symbols and art are often commodified and sold in global markets by non-African companies, stripping the works of their deeper cultural significance and exploiting them for profit. Critics also argue that cultural globalization is essentially a form of Americanization, as American culture has disproportionately shaped global cultural norms. And this kind of dominance of American values can lead to a marginalization of indigenous cultures and contribute to a loss, or has contributed to the loss of cultural diversity. And finally, cultural globalization has contributed to the decline of less commonly spoken languages as global languages like English dominate international business, media, and education. And this has led to the gradual extinction of many indigenous and minority languages, weakening cultural heritage. So, despite revitalization efforts, for example, the Maori language has struggled due to the dominance of English in the media, education, and public life in New Zealand. So hopefully that was really useful. That a lot of these arguments are going to be really important to some of the key questions, especially these 30 markers that you could get asked in the global politics exam. For example, has globalization undermined national sovereignty? We've looked at some of those key arguments. Does it have more advantages than disadvantages? Also, is globalization under threat? Whilst also being a lot of these arguments, particularly the perspectives on globalization, being really useful for some of the possible 12 markers that you could get asked. So yeah, as I said at the start of the video, for all of these questions in bold, we have detailed plans on the Politics Explained website that you can purchase for all of these 12 markers, and the 30 markers should really help you, save you a lot of time and help you prepare for the exam, so make sure to purchase them if you're interested. And yeah, if you've got any questions or comments about the video, please let me know in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.